Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I do hope you're doing remarkably well. I've got a fabulous story for you this evening, so I'm so glad you've joined me. And don't forget to go and get that effervescent sparkling drink or something lovely and warm to drink, because I've got a lovely story for you tonight. So before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's get started with tonight's story.
Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Posy, and my Bigfoot encounter happened in 1984 when I was 16 years old at the time. I was born in James's Island in Charleston, South Carolina, and when I was 8 years old, my parents moved into a green leafy neighbourhood called Sandhurst in the North Bridge area that is associated with the Ashley River and is well renowned for its much-loved fishing pier. Sandhurst is conveniently located and easily accessible to so many conveniences like shopping and restaurants, but the area itself boasts a high standard of living for growing families, which is why I still live here today, in close proximity to my mother's house, where I grew up as a young girl. I grew up in a refurbished 50s-style home that was built on a hilly incline and painted in a soft pastel green shade. It possessed a deep slung grey roof, French wooden windows, and about 20 steep stone steps that led up to a glamorous, stylish wooden front door. The front of the house possessed an extended flat roof that was supported by columns that covered a large porch that overlooked the pretty views of our neighbourhood. I grew up with my brother Daniel, who was 13, and my sister Alicia, who was 10. And I had what I can only describe as an idyllic childhood that was spent largely outdoors, engaging in all kinds of outside pursuits, as in those days we did not have the technological advances of the younger generation today. I never felt we missed out though, but maybe we didn't know any better. My parents would entertain outdoors frequently, and the parties were very commonplace in our home, with barbecues, dancing, swimming and lots of exuberant chatter. In those days we would cycle up and down our road, walk our cocker spaniel Freya in the woods, and play all kinds of games from hopscotch to jump the rope, tag, hide and seek, and invariably swim during the summer months in a pool where we would play Marco Polo, which was our favourite water game. During the summer holidays, my parents would invariably take us on camping excursions or hiking, and we'd often visit coastal destinations like Hawaii or the Oregon coast for our quintessential beach holidays. My story begins when one day my siblings and I went to stay at my grandmother's Virginian country farm for 3 weeks, as both my parents were going on an overseas holiday to Europe, which involved travelling to France, Germany, Italy, Austria, Switzerland and England. My mother had never been to Europe before, so she was exceedingly excited about the prospect of such an exciting adventure. We felt pretty disillusioned as kids not to be accompanying them on this marvellous vacation of a lifetime. My grandparents used to be cattle ranchers on the farm, but they were now retired and still living in their original colonial-style farmhouse, although they were letting out their fields to a local cattle rancher in the area for grazing purposes, as he was growing his business and needed more grazing fields. My grandmother was about 80 years old, and her husband was 100, and both of them seemed to be in remarkably good health, despite their advancing years. My grandfather's charming rustic farmhouse was very old and was in pristine condition, and it was built on an expansive area of meticulous manicured green turf. The extensive area consisted of white-poled fencing for the pastures and ubiquitous trees, a couple of pretty barns, white gravel roads, and vast open prairie land dotted with grazing cows, also areas of dense woodland that was teeming with indigenous wildlife like white-tailed deer, squirrels, chipmunks, raccoons, rabbits, and the list goes on. In the far distance you would observe the masterful triangular mountain ranges rising up into the vast blue firmament like imposing pieces of sculpture. The house itself was a symmetrical farmhouse with whitewashed walls, large windows and a green roof, with a very colonial-looking front porch with columns and steps that led up to the front door. It overlooked the most ravishing panoramic and mesmerising views onto the wide pond and the wooded area that lay beyond. When we moved into this farmhouse, it was exciting being with our grandparents again, and we were having an incredibly good time, as they were always so eager to spoil us. I was soon to learn how deeply depressed my grandfather had become. He really wanted to die. and he made no secret of this fact, and this came as a horrifying revelation to me, one that was impossible for me to fathom. I did notice that he seemed rather downcast and fed up with the world, and he looked like a man that had lost that spring in his step that I remembered so well in his earlier days. I was absolutely amazed that he was being so brutally honest with me about the way he felt, because to look at, he was in remarkably good health. He was lucid and sharp and had no arthritis or health issues like high blood pressure or diabetes. So for a 16-year-old girl, it seemed inconceivable and incongruous that he wanted to leave the earth plane for good. I had no comprehension why anyone could feel this way, and it was a huge enigma to me. At that age, the idea of someone wanting to die seemed ludicrous and preposterous. But I'm glad to say I'm much more understanding now that I'm older, of course, and infinitely wiser, I hope. It was, of course, a very uncomfortable topic, the topic of death, and still is, that most of us would rather not discuss at all.
"Janine," he exclaimed, "I've heard enough. I'm 100 years old. I don't expect you to understand, but I'm tired of it all. I've had about as much as I can take. I want to go."
"But why?" I protested. "You're not even ill. You're not even in pain. It's nonsensical to me."
"Of course it is to you, Janine," he said. "You're young with your whole life ahead of you. You have a springy, youthful body that makes your life flow smoothly for you, without any bumps on the road. It's like the difference between a young and an old car. The young car runs smoothly and effortlessly, easily, but the old car sometimes fails to start, if at all. I am that old, battered and tired car that's not sparkling on all my cylinders, so to speak, and I'm due for the scrap heap any time soon."
"You mean your body feels all worn out?" I asked.
"Exactement, Janine. My body is not what it used to be when I was racing around the farm in my former younger days with all my cows. Now that was living my life to the fullest. I loved spending my days on the farm, riding horses and talking to the cows. It was an attractive life. It was wonderful. I can't do those things anymore. So I'm just existing, living without joy. Now that's not a life. I really want to die. It's as simple as that. It's all about quality of life, Janine. And sitting around all day doing nothing is not my idea of living at all. My life is a shadow of what it used to be in my former days, when my body was strong and able."
"I think I do understand, but even so, Grandpa, you have to wait for your time to die."
"Not necessarily," said my grandfather. "There are ways you can hasten the process."
"But why on earth would you do that?" I asked.
"Believe me, he's tried, Janine," said my grandmother, interceding. "I caught him trying to hang himself once, and I was having none of that, and I put a stop to it immediately. I told him that that was the most selfish thing he could have done, with me finding him dangling in the closet. Could you imagine anything more terrible or horrifying? What on earth would I say to your mother?"
"She'd never forgive you, Grandpa, if you did that to her."
"Never ever. She'd hate you if you did that," I told him.
"That's what I told him," said my grandmother. "Your grandfather's been inquiring about euthanasia with doctors all over the place, but even if assisted suicide were indeed legal, I doubt anybody would give him a lethal cocktail. With him being in such good health, I mean, it would be unethical to do so, as you can imagine. He even had the audacity, Janine, to ask the vet to help him out when we went to take our cat Safi for her annual injections. You should have seen the vet's face. The poor man, he went as white as a sheet and looked like he wanted to pass out from shock. You do it for the animals. Why not for me? I'm like an old dog that needs putting out of my misery. And you have my word that this procedure you perform for me will never leave these walls. No one will ever know. Of course, the vet refused, as you can imagine. The poor man, he was mortified, I think, that your grandfather had had the audacity to ask him for help. He told your grandfather that he wouldn't even euthanize an old dog that was in such good health, as he felt it was morally reprehensible to do so. As you can imagine, I could hardly believe what I was hearing. How could your grandfather be talking like this? Wasn't it unethical and morally wrong to want to take your own life? Did not the Holy Book affirm the wrongfulness of this course of mortal action? Was it not really self-centred of him to leave behind my gran, and let alone us grandchildren as well as my mother, who adored her father? Janine, said my grandmother, I didn't want to tell you about all your grandfather's issues. Goodness knows you're here to enjoy yourself and have a great holiday on the farm, and I don't want to sabotage your lovely holiday here. But I needed you to know about this because you're staying here and your grandfather could potentially attempt to take his own life. He is just so desperate to die. I cannot do anything to stop him. Believe me, I've tried. I've never seen him more determined about anything in my life before, so I would not put anything past him. I even had to hide the rat poison and antifreeze in a cupboard because I didn't trust him. When your grandfather found the lethal poisons hidden in the cupboard in the barn, he laughed at me and thought it all terribly funny. He told me that he may have a death wish, but dying with poison was not an option for him, as it would be too painful, too slow, and a very agonising death. He doesn't want to die in pain, you see. Of course he doesn't, I agreed. He wants to die quickly and efficiently. How do you feel about him, Gran, leaving you on your own like this? If he does die, of course, I mean. I don't feel good about it at all, said my grandmother, wiping away a tear. But your grandfather's insistent about it. He wants to go, and I have to support his wishes. He's 20 years older than me, you see. I'll not help him die with a pillow over his head, of course, because I could never do that to him, never. But he hasn't asked you, I asked in horror, has he? Of course not, Janine, laughed my grandmother. He wouldn't be that mean to me. He's not that self-centred. Impulsive and hot-headed, yes, but selfish, no. No, he's not selfish. Gran, what I don't understand is why Grandpa can't read books, watch television, play card games, chess, go for scenic drives. You don't have to be active to have a full, rich and extraordinary life. You see people all the time who are paralysed, and they manage to have a good life. Why can't he? I agree with you, Janine, wholeheartedly, actually. I'm long in the tooth myself, and yes, my body's not what it used to be, but I find life very rich, rewarding and blissful, and seeing you kids is the highlight of my life. It's my greatest joy. But your grandfather, he's a very active, or at least he was a very active person all his life, and he sees things incredibly different from you and I. He has a whole different perspective on it all. We have to understand that. You would think that my holiday would have been marred by my grandfather's desire to die looming over my head like a dark thundercloud. It would seem being young, whimsical and remarkably naive had stupendous benefits, and as a young mind, I seemed to have a bountiful resilience that was worthy of note. I did not allow such defeatist negative thoughts to ruin my holiday or parade around my mind with its sombre, bleak, bitter and pessimistic outlook. Instead, I helped my grandmother bake cakes and cookies and prepare jams and chutneys for the store cupboard. My young siblings and I would hang out in the woods, playing all kinds of games under the shade of the towering trees. We would also swim in the pool and eat large slices of watermelon. We would visit the cows and ride my grandfather's horses around, washing and brushing their brown coats until they gleamed. We enjoyed feeding them and mucking out their stables. I really got the distinct impression that my grandfather enjoyed having us around, and he played all kinds of games with us. I soon began to forget about the insidious desire he had to end his own life. It all just seemed like a bad dream to me, and for a while I truly imagined it to be just that. Perhaps it is what I wanted to believe at the time. One day as we were sitting eating breakfast on the wooden deck that overlooked the most panoramic mountainous views that were silhouetted like silvery blue hazy shadows against the azure blue sky. The pond that was situated only about 10 yards from the porch literally sparkled in the morning sun, and its gleaming mirror reflected the overhanging trees with boughs that almost hung down into the water. I noticed on a few water lilies with their wide-open pink flowers sat a very large green and black frog that was basking in the sun, snapping up a fly with its long tongue. There were also dragonflies circling the water and several white butterflies floating past us like pretty white petals suspended in the air. I remember for a moment time stood still as I drank in this nectar-rich sweetness of the idyllic, sumptuous haven that I was observing. Suddenly I saw a huge, towering silhouette of a dark creature gliding towards the pond. In an instant, the frog dived into the water and swam away, sensing that a predator was in his midst, and he wasn't prepared to take any chances. I watched in utter amazement as this strange, hairy, humanoid creature paddled into the water and began to swim, keeping her head above the surface as a tiny pink baby, flecked with a few wispy dark hairs that reminded me of a monkey, sat perched on her shoulders and seemed to be enjoying this watery ride. I was astonished, and my eyes grew as wide as saucers, and my mouth was hanging to the ground in amazement. I could not imagine what I was seeing, and I was totally gobsmacked. The critter was easily 8 foot tall, 700 pounds and 3 foot wide, and I was almost certain my estimates were correct. All I know is that this thing was colossal, with a cone-shaped head, overlong arms, powerful shoulders, and a long oval, hairless, deep-tanned face. She was covered with long, flowing, golden-brown hair, which was beautiful and sleek with a gleaming shine to it that looked like it was regularly brushed. I was to find out later that my grandmother had shown this creature how to brush her hair, by manner of practical demonstration, of course, from a distance, and had actually thrown her a hairbrush once, along with a horse comb. Since then, the critter just loved brushing her own hair. Every 6 months my grandmother would buy her another hairbrush, or whenever the critter's hairbrush broke, which was a regular event. I gather the critter would leave the broken hairbrush on the step, and my grandmother would replace it with a brand new one only a day or so later. "What is that?" I asked my grandmother as I observed the critter. "Oh, that's Matilda, the wild woman who lives in the woods." "What is she?" I asked in amazement. "I told you," insisted my grandmother. "She's a wild woman covered with hair. If humans went around naked like that, they would also grow hair. It's no different, dear." "But she is different, Granny," I said. "I mean, her head is cone-shaped, and she's very colossal, and has overlong arms. She's a giant. She can't be human." "That's because she's built for the wild, dear. She's a formidable hunter, and a fine mother at that, even if I say so myself." "Do you see her often?" I asked curiously. "Oh, all the time," said my grandmother, "as we all watch her swimming regularly. It would seem that although conscious of our presence, she didn't appear overly concerned about us watching her swim, and seemed comfortable." "Do you talk to her at all?" I asked my grandmother. "Of course not, dear," chuckled my grandmother. "She doesn't speak our language. The critter, though, acknowledges me and nods, but she's a very quiet, shy, wild woman who keeps herself to herself most of the time. I know there is a male in the woods there too, but he never shows himself to us. He's much quieter than she is." "But she could kill you if she wanted to," I said. "I mean, she looks dangerous and very, very scary." "Well, dear, she wouldn't do that to us because we respect her boundaries, you see. But if we were to attack that child of hers, she'd kill us in an instant without a doubt. I'm certain of that. She's incredibly protective over her young." I noticed that a light seemed to come on in my grandfather's elderly pale blue eyes, like a beacon in a lighthouse illuminating a thought in his mind. Suddenly I heard him say to us, "Bye, I love you all." Then my grandfather raced off the patio and dived into the pond and swam towards the hairy female and started wrestling her for the baby on her shoulders. I watched in horror as the female just used only one arm to hold my grandfather down without any trouble while balancing her youngling on her shoulders, and then with a forceful thrust she continued to hold him down under the water. I did watch him wiggling for a while, and then things became horribly, terrifyingly still, and the female critter allowed my grandfather's lifeless body to finally float to the surface, and even with the baby on her shoulders, she lifted my grandfather's lifeless form out of the pond with her powerfully strong arms, and carried him over to the porch as if he weighed nothing, where both my grandmother and I were sitting. I noticed her brown eyes seemed almost apologetic and empathetic towards us. She placed my grandfather's body in front of my grandmother, and then returned to the pond to complete her swim, almost as if nothing had transpired. But I did notice she looked up at us a couple of times, with a somewhat perturbed, bewildered look on her face, as if she couldn't really make sense of what had happened. "Well, at least he didn't suffer," said my grandmother. "It was a quick death, and I hear drowning is not the most unpleasant way to go." "He planned this," I said angrily. "He planned this. It was deliberate." No, dear, said my grandmother. It was a spontaneous last-minute decision on his part. I think he suddenly realised that the creature could end his life quickly. At least we know he didn't suffer at all, and he's at peace now. Matilda helped us out by ending his life for him. It was a very good way to go, dear. We watched as the hairy critter climbed out of the water, shaking her shaggy coat like a long-haired golden retriever, with a little pink tiny critter still perched on her shoulders and hanging on to her long hair tightly, all the while regarding us with its golden eyes. Finally she nodded and then glided away while she moved her overlong arms backwards and forwards and manoeuvred her powerful legs with 5-foot strides as she bounded towards the woods. Her movements were so fluid she could have been floating. That was how smooth her movements were. I was just so relieved that my 2 younger siblings, who'd been playing marbles under the table, had not seen a single thing, and I was relieved about that. Granny, I said, do you think Matilda knew that Grandad wanted to die? Do you think she was helping out? I have no idea, said my grandmother, but that's the kindest death I've ever seen. I think I'd prefer to go that way than swallow a bunch of pills. Fast forward several weeks, and my parents returned from an amazing holiday, and then we had my grandfather's funeral. But my mother always believed that he'd just drowned in the pond, and we never ever told her the truth, because we didn't want her to suffer more emotional grief. Years later, if I was to find out that Matilda was a Bigfoot, and so there you are. That's my story. Wow, I don't know what to say to that. That is an incredible story. And wow, I don't know whether the Bigfoot knew that your grandfather wanted to die, but it probably was quite a merciful way to go. But oh wow, what a story. Until next time, goodbye and good night.